This story was sent by a viewer who wishes to remain anonymous. Even today, he is afraid to sleep alone at night. No more talking, let's start the story. My name is Calvin Broussard. I'm 52 years old now, and I run an auto repair shop up in Duluth, Minnesota. I've lived in Northwoods country literally my entire life. Born in Cook County, raised in Grand Marais, right on the edge of Lake Superior, I've been hunting and fishing in these forests since I was just a kid, trailing behind my dad with a little .22 rifle. I know these woods. I know them the way you know the inside of your own house. Deeply, naturally, with the kind of absolute confidence you only get from spending a lifetime inside them. I really need to be clear about that before I tell you exactly what happened on November 3rd, 2007. Because the thing that shook me to my core wasn't just what I saw and heard out there. It was that it happened to me, to a guy who had spent over 30 years in those trees without ever seeing a single thing he couldn't explain. Until that night. Superior National Forest covers almost 4 million acres of northeastern Minnesota. We're talking a massive, endless stretch of boreal forest, granite ridges, wolf country, lake country, and the kind of deep November cold that has real teeth to it. I love it. Always have. It's the backdrop to my entire life. And when you spend decades navigating millions of acres of raw wilderness, you develop this internal compass. You learn to read the lay of the land, the angle of the sun, the tiny little shifts in the underbrush. You simply do not get lost. That year's deer hunt was the exact same group I'd been going with for over a decade. You had my brother-in-law, Gary, who's a super methodical, rational high school biology teacher. Then there was my childhood best friend, Frank. Frank and I had been walking these exact woods together since we were maybe 12 years old. And Frank's son, Danny. He was 22, full of energy, maybe a little overconfident on what was only his third serious deer hunt. We set up our base camp on November 1st at this spot Frank and I had used forever. Just a quiet clearing by a small lake, about 11 miles off the main road, done a 2-track logging path I could have driven with my eyes closed. The first couple of days were absolutely perfect. Gary and Frank both bagged their deer on the second, so by that evening, the vibe in camp was just warm and relaxed. The next morning, November 3rd, Danny and I headed out early. We hunted right through the morning, working these ridges about 2 miles northeast of camp. It was completely routine. By 2 in the afternoon, we were looping back toward camp on a route I knew like the back of my hand. And that is exactly when I made my mistake. Now, I say mistake, but I want to be precise here. It wasn't carelessness. What happened that afternoon wasn't getting lost. Not in any normal sense of the word, anyway. We were cutting south and west toward camp, walking a ridge I had personally hiked 100 times, when I stumbled onto a 2-track road I had never seen before. Now, that alone isn't crazy. Superior National Forest has hundreds of miles of old, forgotten logging roads. But this road was in the wrong place. I had a crystal clear mental map of that specific ridge. There was no road there. There had never been a road there. And yet, there it was. 2 distinct tire tracks pressed deep into the frozen leaves, heading south through the trees. Perfectly straight. Perfectly clear. Danny looked at it, sounding a little unsure, and asked, Where does this go? I just kind of brushed it off. Shouldn't be here, I told him. I checked my compass. The road ran roughly south, which was generally the right direction to get back to camp. The alternative was bushwhacking through this incredibly thick, tangled alder brush. So I made a judgment call. I figured we'd just follow the road for a bit. We started walking down this totally unfamiliar path. The forest on both sides was incredibly dense and dark, exactly the way the boreal forest gets in November once the leaves drop. Black spruce and balsam fir just pressing in on us from both sides. Up above, the light was incredibly flat and gray under this heavy, suffocating overcast sky. The road was unusually straight. Normal logging roads naturally curve and weave around the rough terrain, but this thing ran as straight as a ruler, cutting right through the timber. We walked for maybe 20 minutes, and then I just stopped. I looked at Danny and said, we should have hit the lake by now. 20 minutes of walking south should have easily spit us out right at our access road, right within sight of the water. But as I looked around, there was nothing, absolutely nothing but trees in every single direction. Danny tried to rationalize it, said maybe we were just walking slower than we thought, but I shook my head. Something was deeply wrong. I could feel it, the exact same way you can feel a thunderstorm coming, not with your eyes, but somewhere deeper. The air just felt heavier. We're turning around, I told him. We did a 180 and started marching back north. I started counting my steps. Very deliberately, I have a really consistent stride, usually right about 30 inches. So after exactly 600 steps, which mathematically should have put us right back at the exact spot we found the road, I stopped. I looked around. It was the exact same road. The exact same dark forest, that same flat gray light, but I recognized absolutely nothing. I stood there, completely still, trying to think carefully. It's exactly what experienced woodsmen are trained to do when things go sideways. Stop moving, slow down, assess the situation. And that is exactly when the silence hit me. It wasn't just quiet, it was this total, pressurized absence of sound. It was fundamentally different from normal quiet. Look, the Northwoods in November are always quieter than in the summer, but they're never completely silent. You always have the wind whispering in the spruce tops, or the creak of old timber, a raven calling miles away, maybe a woodpecker. There's always something. But out here, nothing. The forest around that dirt road was as silent as the inside of a sealed vault. No wind, not a single branch moving. Even our own breathing sounded muffled and weirdly close to our ears, almost like the air itself was swallowing the sound before it could even travel. I looked over at Danny. He'd gone perfectly still. He felt it too. And then we heard the footsteps. They were behind us, down on the road, coming from the south, the exact direction we had just been walking before I turned us around. They were incredibly deliberate, bipedal, upright. This wasn't the chaotic, frantic crunching of a deer busting through frozen leaves. It wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered in 30 years of trekking through these forests. It was the unmistakable sound of something walking on 2 feet. Heavy, slow, rhythmic. One massive step, roughly every 2 seconds. And they were getting closer. I turned around, incredibly slowly. The road behind us was completely empty. I'm telling you, it was perfectly straight, perfectly clear, just trailing off into the dark trees. There was absolutely nothing there. Nothing visible at all. But those heavy footsteps kept coming, getting closer. I could literally feel the faint vibration of them now, traveling through the frozen dirt, vibrating right up through the thick rubber soles of my hunting boots. Whatever was making that noise, it was unthinkably large. "What is that?" Danny whispered. It was this harsh, choked kind of whisper. You could tell he was working so incredibly hard just to keep from completely losing it, fighting off a full-blown panic attack. He was just staring down that empty stretch of dirt, gripping the stock of his rifle so hard his knuckles were completely white. "I don't know," I told him, and honestly, those 3 words, "I don't know," that was the most terrifying thing I had said in 30 years out in those woods. Because I always knew. That was the whole point of spending a lifetime out there. I always knew what the forest was doing and exactly why it was doing it. But standing right there, on that impossible straight road, listening to massive footsteps walking toward us on visibly empty ground, I had absolutely nothing. No explanation, no frame of reference whatsoever. Then, the footsteps stopped. That crushing, complete silence slammed right back down over us. Danny and I stood there, absolutely motionless. 10 seconds ticked by, 20, 30 agonizing seconds of complete, unbroken stillness. And then, from directly beside us, not behind us on the road anymore, right beside us, from just inside the dark tree line, honestly no more than 15 feet away, we heard it breathing. Low, slow, heavy breathing. It was the massive respiration of something enormous, just waiting slightly out of sight in the dark trees. I stared dead into the forest, but I couldn't see a thing. The spruces were incredibly dense, the daylight was fading fast, and whatever was standing right there was completely hidden in the deep, black shadows between the tree trunks. But I could hear it taking these huge breaths. And in that exact moment, I had this absolute, unshakable conviction, this deep, primitive knowing that completely bypasses your rational brain and just settles into your bones, that whatever was standing in there, it could see us perfectly. Danny grabbed onto my arm, and his grip was like iron. Neither of us moved a muscle. Neither of us dared to speak a word. We just stood there, completely paralyzed on that dirt road for what felt like an absolute eternity, just listening to this massive thing drawing deep, rattling breaths in the pitch black beside us. And then it simply stopped. There were no footsteps walking away. There was no sound of a huge body crashing off into the underbrush. It just stopped, like a sound effect being abruptly switched off. That heavy, crushing silence held us there for another full minute. Then, Suddenly, with this massive exhale of relief, the normal forest sounds just rushed back in. The wind rustling the spruce tops, that distant call of a raven, the normal, everyday texture of a November afternoon in the Northwoods. It all came back at once, exactly like a recording being clicked back on. I looked straight ahead. Barely 30 feet in front of us, that perfectly straight road just abruptly ended at a T-junction that I recognized instantly. It was our main access road. 50 yards down to the right, just gleaming through the bare branches, I could see the familiar gray shimmer of our lake. We had been barely 2 minutes away from our camp the entire time. We didn't say a single word to each other on the walk back. The second we pushed through the tree line and stepped into the camp clearing, Gary looked up from where he was tending the camp stove. He took one single look at our faces and instantly asked, "What happened to you two?" I can't even imagine how I must have looked, but it matched exactly how I felt. Danny just walked right over, dropped heavily onto a log, and didn't speak for several minutes. Eventually, I managed to tell Gary and Frank exactly what had happened out there. Gary listened to the whole thing with the careful, methodical attention of a science teacher. He asked these perfectly rational, clarifying questions. He offered up all these logical explanations, said how sound can carry weirdly in a dense forest, or how the frozen ground might have amplified footsteps from a mile away, or that maybe we were just way more disoriented than we realized. Honestly, it was all totally reasonable, but none of it felt true. Not even a little bit. Frank, though. Frank just listened, without saying anything at all. When I finally finished the story, he stayed quiet for a long time, just staring deep into the flames of our campfire. Then he slowly looked up and asked, "Which ridge were you on when you found that road?" I mapped it out for him, the exact ridge, the direction, the location. Frank just nodded slowly. He picked up this dry stick from the dirt and just kept turning it over and over in his hands. "My father told me something about that area," Frank said. His voice was incredibly quiet, almost reverent. "Years ago, when we first started hunting out here, he told me there's a specific section of that forest. He couldn't say exactly where, just roughly, where things just don't work right, where the woods don't behave." He paused, looking right back into the fire. He said his father told him the exact same thing, that the Ojibwe people, who really knew this country, wouldn't dare camp in that section, wouldn't hunt it. They called it something. I can't remember the exact word, but translated, it meant roughly, "the place where the forest thinks." The whole camp went dead silent. "The place where the forest thinks?" Danny finally repeated, his voice barely even a whisper. Frank just tossed his stick into the fire. "I'm not saying I believe any of that," he said. "I'm just saying what my father told me." We packed up and broke camp the very next morning, a full day early. Nobody even suggested staying. Nobody argued. I've gone back and hunted Superior National Forest plenty of times since 2007. I really do still love those woods. But I have never, ever gone back to that particular section of the ridge. Frank hasn't either, even though we've never actually spoken about it. We just both know. Danny ended up moving down to Minneapolis a couple of years after that trip. He actually called me once, maybe 3 years later, and asked if I had ever come up with any kind of logical explanation for what we heard out on that road. I told him no. He went quiet for a second. Then he told me, "I've been out in the woods a lot since then, hunting, hiking. I'm really not scared of the outdoors." He took this really long pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was just haunting. "But I keep thinking about the way those footsteps stopped, and how there was absolutely nothing there when you turned around. And I keep thinking, it wasn't coming toward us. It was just letting us know it was there." I've turned that thought over in my head 1,000 times since then. And he's right. Whatever was standing on that road, whatever was taking those massive breaths in the shadows right beside us, it wasn't hunting us. It wasn't even threatening us, really. It was doing something far, far more unsettling than that. It was simply making absolutely sure that we knew it existed. I still don't know what lives out in that isolated pocket of Superior National Forest. I don't know what walks on 2 feet through those trees, breathes heavily beside a frozen dirt road, and then just vanishes without making a single sound. I have no explanation for it, and I've finally made my peace with that. But I do think about Frank's father's words sometimes. Usually on quiet evenings when the repair shop is locked up, the night is pitch black, and the wind is howling off Lake Superior. The place where the forest thinks. I believe it now. I believe it completely. If you survived this explainer of Calvin's story, please like and subscribe. Moving on to the next one, this story was sent by a viewer who wishes to remain anonymous. He requested us not to reveal his name because he is still afraid. No more talking, let's start the story. My name is Sandra Pruitt. I'm 44 years old, and I teach elementary school in Lexington, Kentucky. I live a very normal, very quiet life. Predictable routines, 2 cats, a small garden. People who know me, they'd call me sensible, grounded. I am absolutely not the kind of person who tells ghost stories, which is exactly why it took me 11 years to finally tell this one. Back in the summer of 2013, I was just trying to crawl out of the wreckage of a 6-year marriage. My closest friend, Patty, watched me struggle and came up with a plan to help me escape my own head, a 5-day camping trip deep into the woods. We brought 2 others along, Patty's cousin Aaron, who was completely fearless outdoors, and his girlfriend Melissa. Now, Melissa had grown up deep in the Kentucky mountains, and she knew the wilderness better than the rest of us combined. We headed into the Daniel Boone National Forest. It's this vast, deeply isolating expanse covering roughly 708,000 acres of eastern Kentucky. It's rugged Appalachian terrain. We're talking steep sandstone canyon walls, dense hardwood forest, and these creek hollows that are so deep and narrow, sunlight only touches the bottom for a couple of hours a day. It's ancient country. You can literally feel that age in your bones when you stand inside it. Those first 4 days, they were perfect. We hiked, built these massive fires, and slept completely dead to the world. But on the evening of June 6th, Melissa suggested we push off the main trail. She wanted to explore a side hollow she'd heard about from a cousin who hunted the area, mentioning a natural sandstone amphitheater and a gorgeous flat campsite. But then, she added something else, her voice dropping down to this quiet, hesitant murmur. She said her cousin stopped hunting that hollow a few years back. He wouldn't say why exactly. He just told her it didn't feel right in there. Said even the deer avoid it. He never found a single track in 3 whole seasons. Aaron just laughed it off. And that was that. So we left the main trail at 9 the next morning, June 7th. We followed this incredibly faint game path east through the thick hardwood forest. Step by careful step, the terrain dropped steadily while the ridges rose up high on either side of us. Before long, we were walking along the floor of a narrow valley, maybe 200 feet wide, completely hemmed in and trapped by these impossibly steep wooded slopes. That hollow had a distinct feeling to it from our very first step inside. I wouldn't say it was frightening, not during the day anyway, but it was undeniably strange. The very quality of sound was different, muffled, dampened, almost like the air itself was somehow thicker. The light was greener, dimmer, filtering through the dense canopy in a way that made everything feel slightly underwater. But the most unsettling part? The silence. Every other day of the trip, the forest had been completely alive with birdsong. But here, there was absolute, unnatural silence. Not a single bird sang from the moment we crossed into that valley. Right around noon, we reached this sandstone formation. It was this stunning, curved wall of pale stone 30 feet high and draped in ferns, with a freezing cold spring seeping right into a clear pool. It was a perfectly flat ground for the tents. But as we were setting up, Patty found something strange on the rock wall. It was a deeply carved symbol, a circle with lines radiating outward. It looked incredibly old, way older than any of the dated hunter carvings nearby. Melissa just stood there, staring at it for a long time. When Patty finally asked what she thought it was, Melissa just said, old, and she completely refused to say another word about it. Darkness fell over that hollow much earlier than it should have. Those steep ridges completely cut off the evening sun while it was still high up in the sky. By 8 o'clock, the hollow was pitch black and deeply, unnaturally quiet. Aaron and Patty eventually retreated to their tents and fell asleep around 10. Only the fire remained, throwing these long, jagged shadows against the sandstone wall. Melissa and I just sat there, completely alone by the flames, swallowed up in that profound quiet. After a few minutes of heavy, pressing silence, Melissa finally turned to me. "We should keep the fire going all night," she whispered. Her voice was barely carrying over the crackling wood. "Don't let it go out." When I asked her why, she just stared right into the flames for a long time before answering, her face deadly serious. She told me her grandmother used to talk about certain places deep in these mountains, places she called Hainted Hollows. She described them as places where something ancient lives, something that's been down in the earth far longer than any human. She said fire keeps it below, Melissa told me. They don't like the light. A sudden, creeping cold settled deep into my bones, and I knew for a fact it had absolutely nothing to do with the night air. I carefully asked her if she thought this was one of those places. She didn't answer. I just kept the fire burning. Nothing happened until just after 3 in the morning. I was still wide awake, tending the fire, when the silence of the hollow suddenly deepened. The soft white noise of that nearby spring, the faint background texture of the night, all of it just vanished completely. It was replaced by this heavy pressure, a sealed-in quality, exactly as if the hollow had become a closed room with absolutely no connection to the outside world. Every single nerve in my body fired all at once. And then I heard it. It came from below. It wasn't echoing off the slopes or rustling through the trees. It was coming from straight beneath the ground. It sounded like the absolute lowest note a pipe organ can produce. You know, that sub-bass frequency you actually feel vibrating in your chest before your ears even pick it up. But this sound wasn't an instrument. It was coming from something alive. It was breathing. Down directly beneath me, straight through the earth. One slow, enormous inhalation, lasting 15 to 20 agonizing seconds. And then one long, heavy exhalation of the exact same length, 15 seconds in, 15 seconds out. It felt like it was coming from maybe 10 or 15 feet directly beneath the center of our campsite. I scrambled to my feet, letting out this terrified gasp. This wasn't your normal, everyday fear of getting hurt. This was the pure terror of something fundamentally, cosmically wrong. Things do not breathe beneath the earth. Melissa was already wide awake, sitting bolt upright in her sleeping bag, just staring blankly at the dirt. I whispered her name, but she cut me right off. "Don't move," she commanded. Her voice was rapid, rigid with panic, but completely suppressed. "Stay near the fire. Don't talk to it. Don't acknowledge it." I stood absolutely frozen by the flames. The slow, enormous rhythm just kept going beneath us. And then, the ground moved. It wasn't violent like an earthquake. It was a subtle, slow shift, like a massive pair of lungs exhaling and pushing upward through several inches of soil. I literally felt the earth rise and fall beneath the soles of my boots. I couldn't even process what was happening. These physical disturbances started spreading around the camp. The surface of the spring pool trembled violently with every single monstrous exhalation. Little pebbles near the edge of our fire pit actually rolled slightly across the dirt. From inside their closed tent, Patty's voice called out, shaking with absolute blind panic, desperately begging to know what was happening. Melissa ordered them with this cold, terrified authority to stay inside. Under no circumstances were they to come out. For the next agonizing 40 minutes, that breathing slowly began to fade. It didn't just stop suddenly. It diminished gradually, exactly the way a sound fades, when whatever's making it walks away. Except it wasn't moving away laterally across the forest floor. It felt like it was going deeper. It was retreating downward, sinking slowly into some unimaginable, lightless depth, far beneath the floor of the hollow. By 4 in the morning, there was nothing. The suffocating pressure finally lifted, leaving behind this absolute, dead silence that stretched on until dawn. We left at first light. Nobody ate a thing. We broke camp in a frenzy of complete silence and practically ran out of that hollow as fast as our legs could carry us. Aaron and Patty were pale as ghosts, literally shaking. They'd heard the breathing too, and they felt the ground moving right through the thin nylon of their tent floor. The exact second we stepped back onto the main trail, it was like a switch had been flipped. Birdsong instantly erupted all around us in the morning light. Once we were finally safe on the main trail, Melissa spoke. She explained what her grandmother had passed down to her about the old beliefs, knowledge that wasn't just local mountain folklore, but rooted deep in the history of the Cherokee and Shawnee people who lived in those woods thousands of years before European settlement. They believed certain deep places in the forest were occupied by vast presences that existed within the earth itself. Things that rested for spans of time totally beyond human comprehension. Her grandmother called them the Old Sleepers. These haunted hollows, these silent pockets where animals absolutely refused to go, were the exact spots where those ancient things rested closest to the surface. The fire kept it from coming up, Melissa told us, her voice shaking. Fire keeps them below. Aaron asked the one question we were all too terrified to voice. What would have happened if the fire had gone out? Melissa just stared out into the deep trees. My grandmother said nobody who let the fire go out in a haunted hollow ever came back the same, she answered, her voice completely hollow. Some of them didn't come back at all. I have thought about that night almost every single day for 11 years. I went back to the Daniel Boone Forest exactly one time, on a bright, sunny July morning with a group of colleagues. I stayed strictly on the main trails. I didn't go anywhere near that hollow. My life here in Lexington is sensible and it's quiet, but every single night, I keep a candle burning in my bedroom. My sister thinks it's just a little quirk. My therapist calls it a comfort behavior. And maybe they're both right. But when the house is dark and completely quiet, and the very specific quality of that hollow silence starts to creep back into my memory, I look right at that flame.
And I am genuinely, deeply grateful for it. Because fire keeps them below. I believe that with absolutely everything I have.
If you found yourself captivated by this story, please like this explainer and subscribe for more. Moving on to the next one, this story was sent by a viewer who wishes to remain anonymous. Many people who heard this story reportedly woke up at night and checked their surroundings. Hook 18. No more talking, let's start the story. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Nothing more, nothing less. 4 friends, 2 tents, a cooler full of drinks, and that kind of reckless confidence that only comes from being in your late 20s and thinking nothing bad could ever happen to you. The date was October 14th, 2019. It's a date that would eventually be filed under what some call the Tillamook Forest Incident. The destination was Tillamook State Forest in Oregon. Derek Callahan, a 27-year-old living in Portland, had absolutely no idea that a single weekend out in these woods would completely shatter every belief he held about the natural world and, more importantly, about what might be living inside it. Part 1. The Tillamook Forest Incident. The ill-fated trip. There were 4 of them in the group. Derek, his best friend Marcus, Marcus's level-headed girlfriend Jody, and Ryan. Now, Ryan was the experienced one, He was the outdoorsman who read all the hiking blogs and knew the Pacific Northwest like the back of his hand. So, they left Portland on a Friday afternoon, heading west on Highway 6, driving straight into the heart of the Coast Range. If you've never been, Tillamook State Forest covers nearly 364,000 acres of dense, unbroken wilderness. We're talking towering Douglas firs, endless winding forest roads, and this intense isolation that stands in stark, terrifying contrast to the safe, ambient glow of Portland. It is immense, it's remote, and it is entirely unforgiving. Ryan had picked out a dispersed camping spot way off the main trails, just a tiny, hidden clearing right beside a rocky creek. They arrived, got the tent set up, built a fire, and just settled right into the evening. But by 7 p.m., the sun had fully set, and it plunged the forest into this complete, suffocating darkness, bringing us to part 2, the unnatural silence, an abrupt shift. It was the kind of pitch-black night you almost forget exists when you live in a city. And then, the silence started. Now, forests are never actually silent. There's always the wind, the sound of moving water, animals rustling in the brush. But that night, the ambient noise didn't just fade away. It stopped. Literally, it was like a switch had been flipped. Right at 8:30 p.m., the woods went dead quiet. No wind, no creek sounds, which is crazy because the water was only 30 feet away from them. No bugs, absolutely nothing. For over an hour, the forest just sat there, utterly and unnervingly still. Until 9:45 p.m., because that is when the first sound finally broke through the dark. It came creeping out from the north tree line. It was incredibly low and deep, basically a sub-bass frequency, the kind of sound you physically feel vibrating in your chest rather than just hearing it with your ears. It lasted for exactly 4 seconds, and then it stopped. Just 10 seconds of dead silence. Then it repeated. It had this hollow, mechanical regularity to it that was completely stripped of any natural animal wildness. Just this relentless 4-second rhythm booming out of the dark for 20 minutes before vanishing right back into the silence. Part 3, the pale light. It was 11 p.m. by this point. Ryan and Marcus had called it a night and retreated to their tents, which left Derek and Jody sitting all alone by the dying fire. The thick silence just stretched on, and then Jody spoke. In this incredibly quiet, controlled whisper, she told Derek to look at the tree line. Because right there, hovering maybe 80 feet away at roughly head height, was this pale, bluish-white light. It wasn't moving at all. It wasn't flickering like a flashlight bobbing in the hand of a lost hiker. It was just perfectly, impossibly still. Derek and Jody sat frozen, staring at the light, and the light seemed to stare right back. It just sat there, commanding this paralyzing stillness from them. Every instinct in their bodies was screaming at them to keep quiet, to stay close to the fire, to avoid drawing even a single ounce of attention to themselves. They sat there and watched it in agonizing silence for 4 long minutes. And then, very, very slowly, the light began to move. But it didn't step forward toward their camp, and it didn't retreat backward into the woods. It glided laterally, right along the edge of the tree line. It moved left to right with this perfectly smooth motion, and it made absolutely zero sound. No snapping branches, no boots crunching on dead leaves. It traveled about 100 feet through the impenetrable dark, and then it went out. Part 4. The Figure in the Trees. It was now past midnight. Derek and Jody scrambled to immediately wake up Marcus and Ryan. Of course, the guys were irritated at first about being pulled out of a dead sleep, but that quickly dissolved into this grim, tense reality when Ryan, their seasoned outdoorsman, couldn't offer a single logical explanation for what they'd just seen. They all huddled tight around a newly stoked, roaring fire as the night dragged on. The tension in that tiny little clearing just kept building to a suffocating peak. An hour crept by. Out of nowhere, Ryan tightly grabbed Derek's arm. He was staring right past the flames. Standing exactly at the boundary where the firelight met the total blackness of the forest was a massive figure. It easily stood over 7 feet tall, perfectly upright, and entirely still. The thick darkness hid its fine details, but the silhouette itself was undeniable. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But it wasn't just standing there. It was projecting this intense, directed observation right at them. It induced this raw, primal animal fear that just emptied their minds of everything except pure, unadulterated terror. The figure remained completely motionless, like some dark sentry waiting in the trees. Jody gave a panicked, hushed warning, begging him not to do it, but Ryan reached up to his forehead anyway. He clicked on his headlamp. A blinding 400-lumen beam of light cut violently across the campsite and struck the tree line dead on. The figure was gone. It didn't retreat, it didn't turn around and go crashing into the brush. It simply ceased to be there, the very fraction of a second that the light hit the trees. They frantically swept that intense beam back and forth, dragging it across the giant ferns and the massive trunks of the Douglas firs for 5 straight minutes. Absolutely nothing. Marcus turned back to the group, his face totally pale, and declared that they were leaving. Right now. Which brings us to Part 5, the impossible chase, the escape. Breaking down the camp was just a panicked 20-minute blur. They shoved gear into bags, working completely by headlamp and firelight, speaking only in breathless whispers to each other. Nobody dared to turn their back to the tree line. Twice during that frantic scramble, Derek caught these shifting shadows just beyond the reach of their lights. It was that distinct, terrifying feeling of something large and deliberate, pacing back and forth just out of view. They hurried down the narrow, suffocating trail to Ryan's truck, threw themselves inside, locked the doors, and tore out onto the unpaved forest road. Ryan clicked the high beams on, pushing the heavy truck to 25 miles per hour, which is dangerously fast for a winding, rutted-out dirt road in the pitch black. But as they rounded a long, sweeping curve, Ryan slammed on the brakes. Up on the incredibly steep, forested slope to the left of the road, something massive was moving through the old-growth timber. As Derek later described it, something large was matching their speed exactly. At 25 miles per hour, this enormous entity was navigating the dense, treacherous, nearly vertical terrain of the forest in the pitch black. And it was doing it without making a single audible sound over the noise of the truck's engine. Ryan just floored the accelerator. They didn't slow down again until they hit the paved highway 10 miles later. Part 6. The Watcher Folklore. The Post-Analysis. Unsurprisingly, none of them ever returned to that campsite. But 6 months after the incident, Ryan started digging into the history of that specific area of the Tillamook State Forest, and what he uncovered only deepened the nightmare of that night.
He found accounts from 3 other groups of hikers who had camped in that exact same remote sector between 2011 and 2018. Their reports detailed an identical, chilling escalation of events. Step 1, a sudden, unnatural silence falling completely over the woods. Step 2, strange gliding lights appearing right in the tree line at night. And step 3, the overwhelming, horrifying realization of being watched or actively paced by a massive, unidentified entity.
But as Ryan kept digging, he realized these accounts didn't just start in 2011. He uncovered regional legends from the indigenous Tillamook people. These were ancient tales passed down for generations about those deep woods. The stories spoke of an entity associated with that specific, incredibly dense part of the forest, an ancient, deeply territorial presence, a watcher. Something that observed those who wandered too deep into its home, but crucially, did not attack. Eventually, Derek Callahan moved away from Portland, relocating to the drier, much more open forests east of the Cascades. But to this day, he still flat-out refuses to camp anywhere in the Coast Range. Late at night, when his room is perfectly dark and quiet, he still thinks about that pale light drifting silently along the dark tree line. He thinks about the massive figure standing exactly at the boundary of the firelight, and he thinks about something enormous and completely silent, easily keeping pace with a fleeing truck through dense, steep woods in the dark. He leaves his lights on now, forever wondering what exactly is watching in the Tillamook Pines. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to like and subscribe.